The digital clock on the heavy oak nightstand was glowing a harsh, bright red, reading 3:14 in the morning, when I jolted awake, gasping for air as if I had been suddenly pushed underwater. My eyes snapped open to the dark ceiling of our bedroom in Charlotte, and my chest was heaving with a violent, desperate rhythm. Gloria shifted beside me, her breathing completely undisturbed, unaware of the terrifying mechanical failure happening right next to her. I threw the heavy quilt off my legs and swung my feet over the edge of the mattress, planting them flat on the cold hardwood floor. The moment my torso went vertical, I could physically feel a massive, heavy rush of fluid draining down from my neck and chest. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I could hear it echoing in my own ears, a dull, frightening thud that sounded like an engine redlining in the dark. For the previous 2 weeks, I had been waking up with a heavy, swollen face, a dull ache at the base of my skull, and a strange numbness in my fingertips. I had quietly dismissed it as the inevitable, uncomfortable rust of getting older. But sitting there in the absolute silence of the house, gripping the edge of the mattress while my lungs fought to catch up to the air, I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that my own bed had become a dangerous place. I am stepping forward today to break down exactly what happens to the heavy fluids inside our bodies when gravity stops helping us. The dangerous mechanical shift that occurs in our blood vessels the moment we lay entirely horizontal, and the exact permanent structural change I made to my own bedroom that finally stopped my nighttime pressure spikes. I am not a physician, and I am not here to offer you clinical diagnostic advice. I am simply an older man who discovered that the way we have been taught to sleep our entire lives is actively working against our cardiovascular survival. You do not want the first real warning to be an emergency, and you certainly do not want to be betrayed by the very place you go to find rest. For my entire adult life, I held a deep, unquestioned belief that lying down flat on a mattress was the ultimate form of physical relief. I thought sleep was a biological reset button. When the heavy Carolina humidity finally broke in the evening and I lay my head down on the pillow, I assumed my heart automatically went on vacation. I believed that because I was no longer standing, walking, or carrying the stress of the day, my blood pressure naturally dropped to its safest, most peaceful level. I viewed my bed as a sanctuary where nothing could possibly go wrong. When Dr. Evans first diagnosed me with severe hypertension, I spent all my energy monitoring what I did while I was awake. I changed my diet, I started walking in the evenings, and I took my medication right after breakfast. But my morning numbers, the readings I took the very second I opened my eyes, were consistently and terrifyingly high. Sometimes they were higher than when I went to sleep. I was trapped in a paradox that defied all of my common sense. I was doing all the hard work during the daylight hours, but something invisible and incredibly destructive was happening to my body in the dark, entirely erasing my progress while I was unconscious. I spent decades of my life working in public transportation operations down here in the city, managing the dispatch center and supervising the mechanical maintenance of our heavy city buses. Because of that career, I cannot help but view the world through the unyielding laws of fluid dynamics and mechanical pressure. A human body standing upright relies heavily on gravity. Gravity pulls our blood down into our legs. To keep us alive, our heart has to act as a massive, powerful pump, constantly pushing that heavy fluid back up against the pull of the earth. But think about what happens when you take a heavy, closed hydraulic system and you lay it completely flat on the ground. The assistance of gravity instantly disappears. The fluid that was pooling in the lower half of the system suddenly rushes backward, leveling out across the entire machine. When a man my age, already struggling with high blood pressure, lies completely flat on his back for 8 straight hours, the excess fluid that accumulated in his legs during the day violently shifts back up into his chest, his neck, and his head. The heart is suddenly overwhelmed by a massive, returning wave of volume. The pressure inside the delicate blood vessels of the brain equalizes with the pressure in the legs. The internal machinery does not get to rest. It actually has to work significantly harder just to manage the sudden flood in the upper compartments. The consequences of this mechanical reality are completely devastating. When that heavy fluid rushes into the upper body, it swells the tissues in the throat and the neck. The airway, which is essentially just a flexible intake hose, becomes heavy and narrowed. When you fall into a deep sleep, the muscles in that heavy throat relax, and the airway simply collapses under its own waterlogged weight. You stop breathing. Your brain detects a sudden, terrifying drop in oxygen and immediately hits the panic button. It dumps a massive flood of adrenaline straight into your bloodstream, forcing your blood vessels to clamp down tight to preserve whatever oxygen is left. Your heart rate violently spikes. This silent, suffocating cycle can happen 20, 30, or 40 times an hour while you think you are peacefully sleeping. Every single time it happens, the pressure inside your rigid arteries shoots dangerously high. You are essentially putting your cardiovascular system through a brutal, high-intensity stress test while you are entirely unconscious. The pressure rarely goes up alone. It goes up with the habits we ignore. I had been completely ignoring the fact that my flat sleeping position was forcing my heart to fight a losing battle against its own internal fluid. I know exactly what happens when the pressure of that horizontal flood finally breaks the system, because it happened to a man I worked alongside for 15 years. Robert was a senior mechanic at the transit depot, a man who knew every inch of an engine block but completely ignored the warning signs of his own body. He was a heavy man who carried a lot of tension in his shoulders and a lot of swelling in his lower legs by the end of a shift. One morning, he simply did not show up for work. His wife called the depot a few hours later, completely devastated. She said he had gone to sleep in his usual spot on his back, flat on the mattress, and suffered a massive ischemic stroke in the middle of the night. People at the depot talked about it in hushed tones, saying how tragic it was, but at least he passed peacefully in his sleep. They completely misunderstood the reality of the situation. There was absolutely nothing peaceful about what happened inside Robert's body that night. His flat posture caused the fluid to rush to his head, his airway collapsed, his oxygen dropped, and his brain triggered an adrenaline surge that spiked his blood pressure so high that a weakened vessel in his brain simply could not hold the line. He did not pass peacefully. His internal engine violently blew a seal because the pressure had nowhere safe to drain. I remember standing by his toolbox later that week, staring at his perfectly organized wrenches, and realizing that the most dangerous place a man with high blood pressure can be is lying flat on his back. The truth of my own situation was finally laid out for me in stark, undeniable numbers by my daughter Danielle. She works closely with clinical nutritionists and doctors, and she brought a stack of medical printouts to my house one Sunday afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table, and she explained the concept of nocturnal hypertension. She told me that in a healthy human body, blood pressure naturally drops by about 10 to 15% during the night. The medical community calls this dipping. It is the only real chance the arteries get to repair themselves. But when a man is carrying excess weight, excess fluid, and sleeping completely flat, he becomes a non-dipper. The pressure stays elevated all night long. She looked at my morning logs, the high numbers that were terrifying me at dawn, and told me that my heart was never getting a break. The horizontal position was forcing my heart to pump against maximum resistance for 24 hours a day. I realized in that moment that my nighttime gasping, the heavy head, and the swollen face were not signs of aging. They were the mechanical symptoms of a pump slowly drowning in its own fluid. I knew I had to immediately change the structural environment of my sleep. My first instinct was the same mistake almost everyone makes. I grabbed 3 extra pillows from the linen closet and stacked them high behind my head, thinking that propping myself up would solve the problem. I woke up the next morning with a terrible stiff pain in my neck and a blood pressure reading that was just as high as before. The pillows were a false solution. When you stack pillows, you do not elevate your chest. You simply bend your neck at a sharp angle. It is exactly like taking a garden hose and bending it sharply in the middle. You are actually making it harder for the air to flow and harder for the fluid to drain. You are creating a kink in the main line. I needed a solution that respected the structural alignment of the entire body. I needed to fundamentally alter the angle of gravity acting on my entire cardiovascular system. That is when I called my son Marcus. He came over to the house on a Saturday morning, and together we fundamentally changed the mechanics of my bedroom. We did not buy an expensive motorized hospital bed. We used simple, unyielding physics. We lifted the heavy wooden frame of the bed, the side where our heads rested, and we placed solid 6-inch wooden riser blocks directly under the top two legs of the bed frame. We left the bottom legs exactly as they were, resting flat on the floor. When we set the frame back down, the entire bed was resting on a subtle, continuous, unbroken incline from the headboard down to the footboard. It was not a sharp angle, it was just a slight 5-degree tilt, but that quiet, unglamorous, incredibly simple structural adjustment changed the entire trajectory of my cardiovascular health. Let me explain the exact physical relief that happens when you stop sleeping flat. When I lay down on that slightly inclined mattress now, my body remains perfectly straight, but my head and my heart are permanently positioned a few inches higher than my lower body. That subtle angle is enough to reinstate the power of gravity. The heavy, pressurized fluid cannot rush back up into my chest and pool in my neck. Gravity gently, constantly pulls it back down toward my lower extremities. Because the fluid drains away from my throat, the soft tissues in my airway do not swell. Because my airway stays open, I do not stop breathing in the middle of the night. Because I do not stop breathing, my brain never hits the panic button. There is no massive adrenaline dump. There is no violent nighttime spike in my blood pressure. My heart finally receives the biological permission it desperately needs to slow down, rest, and actually dip the pressure to a safe, restorative level. A steady life builds a steadier body, and this simple wooden block became the absolute foundation of my physical stability. The first few nights on the incline felt strange. I felt like I was going to slide down toward the footboard, and my body had to adjust to the new, subtle angle of gravity. But the biological response was immediate and profound. I woke up on the third morning, and for the first time in over a decade, I did not have a headache. The dull, heavy throbbing at the base of my skull was completely gone. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked in the mirror. The puffy, swollen redness that used to dominate my face every morning had vanished. The fluid was no longer trapped in my head. I walked back into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the mattress, and wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm. The machine whirred in the quiet morning air. 124/78. It was the lowest morning reading I had recorded in 5 years. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the digital numbers, feeling a massive, invisible weight physically lift off my shoulders. I was no longer fighting a losing battle in the dark. I had finally learned how to tilt the machine to let the dangerous pressure safely drain away. When Marcus called me a few weeks later to ask how the bed was working, I could hear the deep, genuine relief in his voice when I told him the results. Marcus is 43 years old, a man who spends his days analyzing risk, completely blind to the risks he takes with his own body every night. He works late, falls asleep exhausted, perfectly flat on his back, and wakes up tired. I told him about the fluids, the airway, and the immense mechanical strain of lying horizontal. I told him he did not have to wait until he woke up gasping for air in his 70s to start protecting the engine that keeps him alive. Most people wait for a scare before they change. I had my scare in the middle of the night, and I was determined to pass the lesson on to him before the pressure broke his own lines. Control begins with what you stop normalizing. I stopped normalizing the idea that sleep was automatically safe simply because my eyes were closed. When I sat across from Dr. Evans at my next routine follow-up, I showed him my morning logs. He traced the steady, stable numbers with his pen and gave me a long, evaluating look. He confirmed everything Danielle had told me. He said the simple act of elevating the head of the bed is one of the most mechanically effective, drug-free interventions a patient with high blood pressure can possibly implement. He adjusted my medication slightly downward, acknowledging that my heart was finally resting during the night. I did not boast, and I did not act like I had discovered a magic cure. I simply accepted the reality that I had taken back a massive portion of control over my own survival. I am not cured, and I do not pretend that the threat of high blood pressure has been entirely erased from my life. It is a daily, relentless condition that requires profound respect and constant vigilance. I still have to watch my sodium, I still have to walk in the evenings, and I still have to respect the limitations of my aging body. But the absolute terror of the night is gone. I am preparing for bed right now. The house is quiet. The heavy Carolina heat has finally broken, and Gloria is already reading her book under the lamplight. I look at our bed, resting on its slight, permanent incline, and I no longer see a place of hidden danger. I see a piece of machinery that has been properly calibrated for safety. When I lay my head down tonight, my spine will be straight, my airway will be clear, and gravity will be quietly working in my favor. The road ahead does not have to be a dark, terrifying mystery where our bodies betray us while we sleep. It just requires us to wake up to the mechanical reality of our own biology, to make the structural changes that matter, and to fiercely protect the quiet hours that keep us alive.